The moment I think about most isn't the photographs. It isn't the bank statements, or the hotel receipts, or even the afternoon I sat in Mike's car outside a restaurant and watched my wife laugh at something another man said, a laugh I hadn't heard in our house in over a year. The moment I think about most is smaller than all of that. It's a Tuesday evening in October, and I'm standing in the kitchen doorway watching Laura load the dishwasher. My name is Dave. I'm 38 years old, and at that particular moment, I had been married for 12 years to a woman I believed I understood completely. She's humming something I don't recognize. Her back is to me. The kids are upstairs, Mason doing homework, Emma already half asleep with a book on her face, the way she always falls asleep. The kitchen smells like the lemon dish soap we've used for years, and the light above the sink is doing that faint flicker it's done since August, the one I keep meaning to fix. Everything looks exactly like my life. Everything looks completely normal. And then Laura's phone lights up on the counter. She doesn't look at it immediately. That's what I notice. She just pauses, one hand holding a glass, the other on the dishwasher rack. A half-second pause that most people wouldn't even register. But I've been married to this woman for 12 years. I know how she moves. I know the rhythm of her. And something in that pause wasn't right. She set the glass down, dried her hands on the dish towel, and picked up the phone with her back still turned to me. I watched her shoulders drop, not in relaxation, in relief. I went back to the living room and sat down and opened a book I didn't read for the next 40 minutes. That was the first night I didn't sleep. We had built something real, or at least I had believed we had. 12 years doesn't happen by accident. It happens through shared grocery lists and arguments about thermostat settings and learning each other's silences. Laura and I had met in our mid-20s at a friend's going-away party. She was sharp and funny, and had this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. I fell in love with that quality before I fell in love with anything else about her. We moved in together after 8 months. Married at 26 and 27. Mason arrived 3 years later, then Emma 2 years after that. We bought the house in Carver Ridge, a quiet subdivision on the north side of town, good school district, big enough backyard for the kids to actually use. Laura worked part-time as a medical billing coordinator until Emma started kindergarten, then went back full-time. I worked in logistics management for a regional distribution company. Not glamorous, not dramatic. Steady. We were a steady family. I say all of this because you need to understand what I thought I had before I tell you what I actually had. The changes started, or rather, I started noticing the changes, sometime around late spring of that year. Looking back now, I think they had been building longer than I realized. But spring is when they became undeniable, even if I kept finding ways to deny them. Laura began going to the gym. That alone wasn't strange. She'd talked about it on and off for years. But the timing was new. Evenings, after dinner, sometimes not back until 9 or 9:30. She started buying clothes I hadn't seen before, things that appeared in the closet without comment. A new perfume that I noticed but didn't mention, because mentioning it felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. She started guarding her phone. Not dramatically. Not the way they show it in movies, snatching it away and clutching it to her chest. She was subtler than that. She started keeping it face down on the nightstand instead of face up. She started taking it into the bathroom. When it buzzed while we were watching television, she'd glance at the screen in a way that was almost casual, but she'd shift her body slightly, just enough so I couldn't see it from where I was sitting. I noticed that shift. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and kept watching whatever we were watching. There was an evening in late May when she mentioned, offhandedly, that a coworker had invited her to a wine tasting event the following Saturday. I said that sounded nice. She looked at me like she'd expected a different reaction. "You don't mind?" she asked. I said of course not. She nodded slowly, and something passed across her face that I couldn't read. She came home from that event just after midnight, and she was in a good mood I hadn't seen in months. Animated, a little flushed. She hugged me from behind while I was watching the end of a game, laughed at something I said that wasn't particularly funny, and fell asleep almost immediately. I lay awake beside her and thought about her laugh in the kitchen that evening. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd been under stress at work, a contract renegotiation that had been grinding for weeks. I wasn't sleeping well. Tired men make poor observers and worse interpreters. I kept telling myself that through June. The first concrete thing I can point to happened on a Friday evening. I came home early because the renegotiation had finally concluded, not ideally, but concluded, and I stopped at the grocery store to pick up something to cook, a small celebration for nobody in particular. I texted Laura to let her know I was making dinner. She didn't reply. She arrived home an hour and 40 minutes later than usual. When I asked where she'd been, she said she'd had coffee with Julie, a friend from her office. Her phone buzzed twice while she was setting down her bag, and she answered it in the hallway. I heard her say, "Yes, and I know, and not right now," before her voice dropped into something lower, a near whisper that didn't carry to the kitchen. I stood at the stove and stirred pasta sauce and thought, "You are building something out of nothing." And then I thought, "Or you are the last person to understand what is already built." Mason came downstairs and asked what was for dinner, and I was grateful, in a way I couldn't fully explain, for the interruption. By July, I had started paying attention in a different way. Not suspicion exactly, not yet. More like a low-level alertness that I couldn't switch off. The kind of awareness that makes you notice small things you would have previously passed without a second thought. Laura started mentioning a name. Derek. It came up the way background characters come up in someone's life. Casually, contextually, without weight. Derek from the finance side of the building had apparently moved to a new office closer to her department. They had mutual colleagues. He'd made a joke at a company lunch that she repeated to me. I listened and nodded and thought nothing of it. I didn't know then that I was already being managed. She began taking longer to come to bed at night. I'd wake at 1 or 2 in the morning and find her side of the bed empty, and then I'd hear her moving quietly downstairs, the faint glow of her phone visible under the bedroom door when she eventually came back. When I asked once, half asleep, she said she couldn't sleep and had been reading. I believed her. She had always been a light sleeper. That was the version of events I chose, because the alternative cost more than I was ready to pay. In early August, she told me she was attending a work conference in Columbus. 2 nights, Thursday and Friday. She showed me the email. I only half looked, which I have thought about many times since. I helped her pack her bag. I drove the kids to school both mornings and handled the bedtime routine alone and felt, if anything, quietly proud of how well I managed it. On Friday night, Emma asked when Mommy was coming home, and I said tomorrow, and she accepted that completely, the way 8-year-olds accept the facts they're given. I sat on the edge of her bed after she fell asleep, and something that wasn't quite a thought and wasn't quite a feeling moved through me slowly, like cold water. When Laura came home Saturday afternoon, she was tired in a particular way, not the exhausted, blurred tiredness of long meetings and bad hotel sleep. Something else. An unwinding. Like someone returning from something they had needed. I asked if the conference went well. She said it was useful. She went upstairs to unpack. 3 weeks later, I called the hotel. I'm not sure what made me do it. There was no single moment of decision. I had the conference email address. I'd kept it in my drafts for no reason I could name. I called the hotel's front desk on a Tuesday afternoon from my car in the office parking lot and asked, carefully, whether they could confirm a reservation for a corporate event that weekend. The woman I spoke to was polite and efficient. There had been no corporate event that weekend. The hotel had hosted a medical supply conference the week prior, and a wedding the weekend following. Nothing in between. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I didn't call Laura. I didn't drive home and confront her. I sat there until the light changed and the lot filled up with people leaving work, and I thought with a kind of terrible clarity, I need to know what I'm dealing with before I say a single word. That evening I texted Mike. Mike and I had been friends since college, the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance because it never really lapses. He'd gone into security consulting after a stint in the Army, and somewhere in the last decade had branched into private investigation. I had teased him about it once at a reunion. I didn't feel like teasing him about it now. I kept the text simple. Can we meet for lunch this week? Something I need to talk through. He replied within minutes. Name the day. Looking back, that text was the moment I stopped pretending. Not the hotel call, not the phone face down on the nightstand, not the conference that never happened. The moment I asked for help was the moment I admitted to myself what kind of help I needed. Everything before that was noise. This was the first real signal I chose not to ignore. And even then, some part of me was hoping Mike would sit across from me at lunch, hear everything I had, and tell me I was constructing a problem from fragments. That I was tired and stressed and reading shadows wrong. He didn't tell me that. Mike listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. He let me lay everything out. The phone behavior, the late evenings, the Columbus conference that hadn't existed, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. How long has this been building? He asked. 4 months, I said. Maybe more. He nodded. And you haven't said anything to her? No. Good, he said. Then, don't. He explained what he needed from me and what I needed to do, which was essentially nothing except act as normally as I could manage. He would handle the rest. He said this with the calm practicality of someone describing a logistics problem, which was, in a strange way, exactly what I needed from him in that moment. What Mike found over the following 3 weeks arrived in pieces, and each piece landed differently. The first was photographic. Laura and a man I didn't recognize entering a restaurant in the Riverside district, the kind of place you go when you don't want to run into people you know. 2 hours later, leaving. The photographs were time-stamped. She had told me that evening she was having dinner with Julie. The second piece was the finance records. Mike had a contact, and what they uncovered explained several things I had dismissed over the previous months as spending I hadn't tracked carefully enough. A hotel on Brandywine Road. Not far, actually, distressingly not far. Several restaurant charges on evenings she had been at work late, or at Julie's. Nothing individually enormous. Together, across 6 months, it added up to close to $4,000 from our joint account that had moved in directions I had never authorized. I remember sitting with those documents spread across Mike's kitchen table and feeling something very still settle over me. Not rage. Not grief. Something more like resolution, the specific calm of a person who has finally located the thing they were looking for and understood that now, at last, they know exactly what they're dealing with. The man in the photographs was Derek. Mike identified him through his company profile. 42, married, a detail that arrived like a secondary blow, 2 children of his own, senior position in the finance division of Laura's company. He drove a dark blue Audi that I now recalled seeing once, briefly, when I'd picked Laura up from work on a day her car was in the shop. She'd pointed him out, I realized. She had pointed him out to me as a face in the parking lot, and I had waved vaguely in his direction and thought nothing of it. I had waved at the man sleeping with my wife. I kept that specific detail to myself for a long time. There's a particular kind of humiliation in it that doesn't get easier with distance. We hit the first real setback in mid-September. Laura apparently sensed something had shifted. Not in me, I was careful, but she changed her patterns. Different restaurants, varying her routes home, switching to a second phone for a period that Mike identified when the primary line went unusually quiet. It cost us nearly 2 weeks and forced Mike to adapt his approach. During those 2 weeks, I lived inside a performance. I cooked dinner. I helped Mason with a geography project on the Louisiana Purchase. I sat on the bathroom floor with Emma while she cried about a falling out with her best friend at school and told her that sometimes people we trust let us down, and it doesn't mean we did anything wrong. I meant every word. I was speaking to her and to myself simultaneously. The second phone was a thread that eventually pulled loose on its own. Mike traced the number through a network I didn't ask him to explain, and what it revealed was worse in texture than in content. The content I had already intuited. But texture matters. The language of those messages was the language of people who had been doing this for a long time, and had stopped being careful because they believed they were safe. They had been meeting since February. 8 months, including the Columbus weekend, which had been a trip to a lake house that Derek's company maintained for clients. She had told me she was at a professional conference. She had packed a bag in our bedroom while I made coffee downstairs, and she had kissed me goodbye at the front door, and she had driven to a lake house with another man and stayed for 2 nights. I processed this information alone, in my car, in the dark, in the parking lot of a grocery store where I had told Laura I was picking up milk. I went inside and bought the milk. I came home. I put it in the refrigerator. I said the evening had been fine. The third piece of evidence arrived not from Mike, but from a direction neither of us had anticipated. Derek's wife called me. Her name was Danielle. She had found my name through the same kind of cross-referencing Mike had used in reverse. Company directories, mutual connections. She was composed in a way that told me she had been composed by necessity for some time. She said she had documentation. She said she was willing to share it. She said she wasn't calling to cause pain. She was calling because she was protecting her children, and she thought I might be protecting mine. We met for coffee the following morning at a place neither of our spouses would frequent. She brought a folder. I brought mine. We sat across from each other like two people who had been assigned the same unwanted project and were deciding how to divide the work. Danielle had screenshots. She had records of cash withdrawals Derek had made that corresponded to the hotel charges I'd traced from our joint account. They had been splitting costs, which meant Laura had spent our money on this. She had a recording, made legally, she assured me, in a state where one-party consent applied, of a phone call in which Derek discussed the relationship explicitly, including references to Laura's knowledge that both of them were married. She also had something Mike hadn't found yet, evidence of a conversation between Laura and a mutual friend in which Laura discussed her plans for the marriage going forward. The word custody appeared. The phrase, "I've already talked to someone," appeared. Laura, it seemed, had been quietly consulting with a family attorney for at least 6 weeks. She was planning to leave. On her timeline. With her preparation. With her version of events ready. I drove home from that coffee meeting and sat in the driveway for a while. The lights were on in Mason's room. I could see Emma's silhouette moving past her window, probably getting a glass of water the way she always did before bed. I called Jennifer that afternoon. Jennifer had been recommended by a colleague whose divorce, 2 years prior, had been complicated and ultimately settled in his favor. She was direct, methodical, and said exactly what I needed to hear. Document everything, say nothing prematurely, and do not leave the family home under any circumstances until advised. I had never felt less like myself than I did during those weeks. And I had never, if I'm honest, thought more clearly in my life. Jennifer had advised me on timing, and I trusted her judgment absolutely. The confrontation, she said, should happen after the legal framework was in place, after the petition had been filed, after the financial disclosures had been formally initiated, after we had established a paper trail that would be extremely difficult to contest. The moment you confront her, she said, the clock starts. Make sure your clock is already ahead of hers. We filed on a Monday. Laura received the formal notification on Wednesday morning, delivered to her office. Mike had suggested the office for reasons I'll leave unstated. Jennifer had prepared a comprehensive filing that included the financial documentation, the surveillance evidence, and Danielle's materials, a body of evidence that she described, without apparent emotion, as thorough. I was at work when it happened. My phone rang at 10:47 in the morning. Laura's name on the screen. I let it ring. She called 4 more times before noon. The 5th time I picked up. There was a silence of 3 or 4 seconds before she spoke. I recognized the silence. It was the silence of someone recalibrating in real time, adjusting from what they had prepared to say to what the situation actually required. Dave. Her voice was controlled. Barely. Laura. I need you to come home. I'll be home at 6, I said. We can talk then. Another silence. You knew, she said. Not a question. We'll talk at 6, I repeated and ended the call. I did not, as it happens, feel victorious in that moment. I felt exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I thought about Mason and Emma, and the way Emma had cried on the bathroom floor about her friend, and I thought about what I was going to tell them and how and when. I thought about those things more than anything else for the rest of that afternoon. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I got home. The kids were at my mother's. I had arranged that Tuesday evening, explaining only that Laura and I needed to talk privately. My mother had asked no questions, which is one of the things I love about her. Laura looked like someone who had spent 8 hours managing her own panic, composed in the way that takes enormous effort. She had a glass of water in front of her that she wasn't drinking. I sat down across from her. She started with an apology. Not the real one, the preliminary one, the one that's designed to establish tone before the real negotiation begins. She was sorry I had found out this way. She was sorry things had gotten so far. She had been going through something she couldn't fully explain, and she knew that wasn't enough, but she needed me to understand. I put the folder on the table. She stopped talking. Jennifer has everything, I said. The photographs, the financial records, Danielle's documentation, the phone records. The filing has already been submitted. I'm not here to negotiate tonight. I'm here because we've been married for 12 years, and I thought you deserved to hear it from me directly. She stared at the folder without opening it. Something moved across her face that I can only describe as the expression of a person watching the last exit appear and disappear in the same instant. You've been planning this, she said. You've been planning yours for 6 weeks, I said. I found mine necessary. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, her composure had changed. Something underneath it had given way, and what replaced it was something rawer and less managed. She said she had made a terrible mistake. She said she didn't want to lose the family. She said Derek had meant nothing, a phrase that landed in the room with a particular flatness, as phrases do when they arrive too late. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't argue. I had learned, somewhere in those weeks of silence, that some things don't require a response. They require only to be witnessed. When she stopped talking, I said, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry anymore. I was angry for a long time before you knew about any of this. What I am now is certain. And I need you to understand that the certainty is not something you can talk me out of. She asked if there was any possibility at all, of working through this. She said she would do whatever was needed. Therapy, separation, a pause. Whatever I needed. I said what I needed was a fair custody arrangement and a clean financial settlement, and that Jennifer would be in touch. She cried then. Genuinely, I think, not strategically. I watched her cry and felt a complicated grief that I don't think I have the language for. 12 years is not nothing. The person across from me was not only the woman who had taken money from our account to pay for hotel rooms with another man. She was also the woman who had held Mason for the first time in the delivery room and wept with a happiness I had never seen on a human face before. She was both of those things simultaneously, and sitting across from her, I understood that this was perhaps the most painful part of all of it. Not the betrayal itself, the coexistence. I went upstairs and slept in Mason's room that night, and I slept, against all odds, deeply. The legal process took 7 months. Laura retained her own attorney, a man named Gordon who Jennifer described, without elaborating, as manageable. There were negotiations and counterfilings, and one particularly difficult week in February, when Laura's attorney attempted to reframe the financial withdrawals as routine household spending, an argument that collapsed quickly under Jennifer's documentation. Laura tried twice more to reopen a personal conversation with me. The first time was in November, a text that arrived late on a Sunday night. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I keep thinking about what I threw away, and I don't know how to live with that. I read it and didn't reply. The second time was in January, a handwritten letter left in the mailbox, not sent through attorneys, just placed there, in an envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. I read it. It was genuine, I think. She had entered therapy, she said, and was beginning to understand things about herself she should have understood years ago. She was not asking for another chance. She just needed me to know. I held the letter for a long time. Then I put it in the same folder as everything else. Danielle and I spoke several times during those months. Her own divorce proceedings moved parallel to mine and occasionally intersected. There were moments where our legal teams coordinated on financial evidence. She was, in a strange way, the person who understood most precisely what I was going through, because she was going through the same thing from a different angle. We never became close friends exactly, but there was a specific respect between us that I value. She rebuilt well. I heard later she had taken a new position in another city. The custody hearing was in March. A Tuesday, overcast, the parking lot outside the courthouse still holding gray snow from the weekend. Jennifer was precise and thorough. Gordon attempted several approaches that did not survive contact with our documentation. The judge was a woman in her late 50s who asked clear questions and took notes in a small spiral-bound notebook. Laura sat at the opposing table in a dark blazer I didn't recognize, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes forward. About halfway through the proceedings, she asked for a brief recess through her attorney. When we resumed, she was composed again, but in the hallway during the recess, I had heard, through the door that hadn't fully closed, her asking Gordon in a low, urgent voice whether it was too late to present a different offer. It was too late. The judge awarded me primary residential custody of Mason and Emma, with generous scheduled time for Laura. The financial settlement reflected the documented withdrawals. Jennifer walked out of the courtroom with an expression of professional satisfaction that was the closest I had seen her come to a smile. In the hallway afterward, Laura stopped beside me for a moment. Gordon was a few feet away, on his phone. She said, "I know there's nothing left to say. I just need you to know that what I did to you, and to them, I will spend a long time paying for. Not in court. Just, I know what I did." I looked at her. "Take care of yourself, Laura," I said. "For their sake." She nodded once and walked away. Mason is 11 now. Emma turned 9 in April. They have adjusted with the particular resilience that children have when the adults in their lives make consistent effort, which I have tried to do. They see their mother on the schedule the court established, and they love her, and I have never said a single negative word about her in their presence. I intend to keep it that way. Mike took me fishing on a Saturday in May, a few weeks after the hearing. We sat in a rented boat on a quiet lake and didn't catch anything significant and talked about other things entirely. It was one of the better days I can remember. I think about that Tuesday evening in October sometimes. Laura at the sink, humming something I didn't recognize, that pause before she picked up the phone. I think about how much was already decided in that moment, by her, by whatever path she had already started down, and how little I knew. I couldn't have known. That's not self-forgiveness. It's just accuracy. What I know now is that the life I have is mine, completely, in a way the previous one never quite was. Not because it's easier. It isn't. But because I'm not performing steadiness anymore. I'm just steady. Emma asked me last week if I was happy. Out of nowhere, the way she asks things. We were making sandwiches for lunch, and she looked up at me and asked. I told her yes. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her sandwich. That was enough. What this story ultimately describes is not a marriage that failed. It describes a marriage that was already hollow by the time anyone noticed, and the particular way that hollowness hides itself inside ordinary life. Laura did not wake up one morning and decide to betray her family. She made a sequence of smaller decisions, each of which was a degree further than the last, until the cumulative distance was too large to measure honestly. That accumulation, the slow drift that never announces itself as drift, is what makes this kind of damage so difficult to detect and so total when it finally surfaces. There is no single moment to point to and say, here, this is where it broke. It broke in February, and in May, and in October, and in every deliberate silence in between. What Dave's experience reveals about trust is something that applies well beyond infidelity. Trust, once extended completely, becomes a kind of blindness, not a weakness exactly, but a natural consequence of intimacy. We stop watching the people we love because watching them would imply we doubt them, and doubt feels like a betrayal of its own. Laura understood this instinctively. The very security Dave felt in the marriage was the mechanism she used to operate within it unseen. His trust was her cover, and she accepted that arrangement without, it seems, fully reckoning with what that meant about what she thought of him. The financial betrayal is worth examining separately from the emotional one. There is something specifically cold about using shared money, money built from shared labor, shared planning, shared sacrifice, to fund a parallel life. It suggests a kind of compartmentalization that goes beyond physical infidelity. Laura had mentally separated her family's resources from her own desires so completely that she apparently experienced no meaningful conflict in drawing from one to fund the other. That level of internal partition doesn't develop overnight. It develops through months of practice, of justification, of small permissions granted to oneself. Each withdrawal was, in its own way, a decision to devalue the marriage in exchange for something she wanted more.